Have you ever sat in a sterile government building, watching the person you trusted most in the world walk away from you during your darkest hour? Have you ever felt the crushing weight of financial ruin pressing down on your chest, while the man who promised to stand by you through everything simply vanishes when you need him most? I never imagined that a Tuesday morning in November would become the day I discovered that my entire life had been built on lies, and that the business we created together was nothing more than an elaborate scheme to destroy me financially while he walked away unscathed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights in the Maricopa County Superior Court buzzed overhead like angry wasps as I sat alone on the hard wooden bench outside. Room 4B, my hands trembling as I clutched a manila folder containing what I believed were the last remnants of our failed business. The folder felt impossibly heavy in my lap, weighted down not just with legal documents but with 6 years of marriage and 5 years of building Mitchell & Chang Marketing Solutions from nothing into what I thought was a thriving company. The irony wasn't lost on me that our business name was emblazoned across the cover of these bankruptcy papers, as if mocking everything we'd worked for together. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and until 3 months ago, I thought I knew exactly who I was. At 32, I believed myself to be a successful entrepreneur, a loving wife, and someone who had finally figured out how to balance ambition with partnership. I had spent the last 5 years pouring my heart, soul, and every ounce of creative energy into our digital marketing agency, working 16-hour days to land clients, designing campaigns that helped small businesses flourish, and building what I genuinely believed was our shared dream. The office walls were covered with thank you notes from grateful clients, awards for innovative campaigns, and photos of our team celebrating milestones that felt meaningful and real. But as I sat in that courthouse hallway, watching lawyers in expensive suits stride past with their briefcases and confident expressions, I realized that everything I thought I knew about my life had been carefully constructed fiction. The woman who had spent countless nights staying up until dawn perfecting client presentations, who had sacrificed friendships and family time to build something lasting, who had trusted completely in the partnership she thought she shared with David, was discovering that she had been nothing more than a convenient front for something far more sinister. The clock on the wall read 8:47 a.m., and our hearing was scheduled for 9 o'clock sharp. David had promised to meet me here at 8:30, giving us time to review our statement one final time before facing the judge who would decide the fate of our company and, as I understood it then, our financial future together. We had rehearsed our explanation countless times over the past weeks, describing how the economic downturn had affected our client base, how several major accounts had suddenly pulled their contracts, and how unexpected expenses had snowballed into an insurmountable debt that bankruptcy was our only option to resolve. I had memorized every line of our financial statements, every detail of the timeline that led to this moment, and every piece of documentation that supposedly proved we had done everything possible to save the business before resorting to this final measure. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have imagined in my wildest nightmares, was that the very man who had helped me prepare these statements had been systematically hiding the truth from me for months, perhaps years. The morning had started like any other day that had become routine in our household over the past few months. I woke up at 5:30 to the sound of David's alarm, finding him already dressed in his most serious navy suit, the one he wore to important client meetings and the few court appearances we'd had to make during this ordeal. He moved around our bedroom with practiced efficiency, adjusting his tie in the mirror and checking his phone with the kind of focused attention that had become increasingly common lately. I had learned not to interrupt these morning routines, understanding that the stress of our situation had made him more withdrawn and less communicative than the man I had fallen in love with 7 years earlier. "Coffee's ready downstairs," he said without looking at me, his voice carrying the same distant tone that had replaced the warmth I remembered from better times. "I'll grab something on the way to the courthouse. Traffic might be heavy, and I want to get there early to find parking." I nodded from bed, still trying to shake off the restless sleep that had become my nightly struggle. The anxiety of impending financial ruin had a way of seeping into dreams, turning even rest into another source of stress. "Should I meet you there? Or do you want to drive together?" I asked, genuinely unsure of the protocol for appearing at your own bankruptcy hearing and hoping that presenting a united front might somehow help our case. David paused in the doorway, his silhouette framed against the hallway light, and for a moment I thought I saw something flicker across his face. It might have been guilt, or uncertainty, or perhaps just the general exhaustion that we were both carrying like invisible weights. "Actually, I need to stop by the office first to grab some additional documentation that Robert thinks might help," he said, referring to Robert Hayes, the bankruptcy attorney we had hired to guide us through this process. "Why don't you head over directly, and I'll meet you outside room 4B at 8:30. That'll give us plenty of time to get organized before the hearing." The plan seemed reasonable, even considerate, giving me a few extra minutes to gather my thoughts and compose myself before what I expected would be one of the most difficult mornings of our lives. I had dressed carefully in my most professional outfit, a charcoal gray suit that I had purchased for client presentations back when we could afford such luxuries, paired with simple jewelry and minimal makeup that I hoped conveyed the appropriate level of seriousness and remorse for our financial situation. Looking back now, I realize how naive it was to worry about making the right impression on a judge when the person I should have been most concerned about was the man who was supposed to be standing beside me. The drive to downtown Phoenix had been surprisingly peaceful, with less traffic than David had predicted and enough time for me to stop for the coffee that had become essential to getting through these increasingly difficult days. I had even arrived at the courthouse 15 minutes early, using the extra time to review our paperwork one final time and mentally prepare for the questions I expected the judge might ask. The bankruptcy process had been explained to us in detail during multiple meetings with Robert, and while it was undoubtedly humiliating to admit financial failure so publicly, I had convinced myself that it was simply a necessary step toward rebuilding our lives and our business on more solid ground. Sitting in the courthouse lobby, I watched other people navigate their own legal challenges with varying degrees of confidence and distress. There were families huddled together over custody paperwork, business owners looking as overwhelmed as I felt, and lawyers moving through the halls with the kind of purposeful energy that comes from understanding systems that seem incomprehensible to everyone else. I found some comfort in recognizing that financial difficulties and legal complications were far more common than I had previously realized, and that David and I were certainly not the first entrepreneurial couple to face bankruptcy as a result of circumstances beyond our control. By 8:20, I had positioned myself outside room 4B as planned, alternating between reviewing our documents and checking my phone for any messages from David about his progress at the office or potential delays in traffic. The courthouse was busier than I had expected, with a steady stream of people moving through the hallways carrying their own folders and wearing expressions that ranged from determined to defeated. I tried to project confidence, reminding myself that this hearing was simply a formality and that we would emerge with a clear path forward, free from the crushing debt that had been suffocating our business and our marriage for months. 8:30 came and went without any sign of David or any communication explaining his delay. I told myself that traffic or difficulty finding the additional documentation at our office could easily account for a few minutes, and that there was no reason for concern. By 8:40, I had sent a text message asking for an estimated arrival time, trying to keep the tone light and supportive rather than anxious or demanding. When 8:50 arrived with no response and no sign of my husband, the first tendrils of real worry began to creep into my consciousness. I called his phone directly, listening to it ring 4 times before going to voicemail, his familiar voice asking callers to leave a detailed message and promising a prompt response. "Hey, it's me," I said, working to keep my voice steady despite the growing knot in my stomach. "I'm here outside the courtroom, and I'm starting to get a little worried. The hearing starts in 10 minutes, and I haven't heard from you. Please call me back as soon as you get this message." By 9 o'clock, when our case was called and I found myself standing alone before Judge Patricia Morrison's bench, the worry had transformed into something approaching panic. I approached the judge with as much composure as I could muster, explaining that my husband and business partner had been delayed but would certainly arrive shortly, and requesting a brief postponement to allow him time to join the proceedings. Judge Morrison, a woman in her 50s with gray hair and intelligent eyes that had clearly seen countless similar situations, regarded me with what might have been sympathy or simply professional patience. "Mrs. Mitchell," she said, consulting the paperwork in front of her, "I understand that unexpected delays can occur, but bankruptcy proceedings require the presence of all parties involved in the filing. Do you have any way to contact your husband and determine his estimated arrival time?" I tried calling David's phone again, this time with the judge and court reporter watching, and again received no response. The silence felt deafening in the formal atmosphere of the courtroom, highlighting not just his absence, but the growing realization that something was fundamentally wrong with this entire situation. "Your Honor, I'm not sure what could have caused this delay," I admitted, feeling heat rise in my cheeks as the embarrassment of the situation began to sink in. "David left home this morning specifically to attend this hearing, and he's never been unreliable about important commitments like this." Judge Morrison nodded with the kind of measured understanding that suggested she had encountered similar situations before, though hopefully not under circumstances quite like these. "I'm going to postpone this hearing for 2 hours, until 11 o'clock, she decided. "This will give your husband time to resolve whatever emergency has prevented his attendance, and it will give you an opportunity to contact your attorney for guidance on how to proceed. If Mr. Mitchell hasn't arrived by 11, we'll need to discuss alternative options for moving forward with this case." I thanked the judge and gathered my papers, trying to project more confidence than I felt as I walked out of the courtroom and back into the hallway where I had spent the previous hour waiting. The 2-hour reprieve should have felt like a relief, providing ample time for David to resolve whatever crisis had prevented his attendance, and for us to regroup before facing the judge together. Instead, it felt like a stay of execution, delaying an inevitable reckoning that Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Was only beginning to understand. I tried calling Robert Hayes, our bankruptcy attorney, but reached his voicemail with a message indicating that he was in court on another matter and would return calls as soon as possible. I tried David's phone repeatedly, each unanswered call increasing my sense that this was more than a simple delay or miscommunication. I even called our office, thinking perhaps he had become engrossed in locating the additional documentation he had mentioned and had lost track of time, but the call went straight to the general voicemail system, with no indication that anyone was in the building. As the minutes ticked by and my calls and text messages went unanswered, I began to consider possibilities that I had never imagined could apply to my life. Could David have been in an accident on his way to the courthouse? Could there have been an emergency with his family that had required his immediate attention? Could our office have been broken into, creating some crisis that needed his urgent response? Each potential explanation seemed plausible individually, but collectively they created a pattern that suggested something more deliberate was happening. It was while I was sitting in the courthouse cafeteria, nursing a cup of coffee that had grown cold and trying to think of anyone else who might know David's whereabouts, that my phone finally rang with an incoming call. But it wasn't David's name on the caller ID. Instead, I saw Lisa Rodriguez, my younger sister who worked as a paralegal for a family law firm in Tempe, and who had been one of my strongest sources of support throughout the stress of the past few months. "Sarah," Lisa's voice was urgent as soon as I answered. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly. Are you sitting down?" "I'm in the courthouse cafeteria," I replied, immediately sensing that whatever she was about to tell me was going to be significant. "David didn't show up for our bankruptcy hearing this morning and I can't reach him. Please tell me you have some explanation for what's going on." There was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that precedes life-changing information. "Sarah, I need you to listen to me very carefully," Lisa said, her voice taking on the measured tone she used when dealing with particularly sensitive legal matters. "I've been doing some research based on some concerns that have been bothering me about your situation, and I think David might not be who you think he is. I think he might have been preparing for this day for a very long time." "What do you mean?" I asked, though part of me already knew that I didn't want to hear the answer. "I mean that the bankruptcy you think you're filing together might not actually include both of you," Lisa said carefully. "I mean that the debt you think you share might not be in both of your names. And I mean that the man who promised to stand by you through this might have been planning to leave you holding the bag all along." The words hit me like physical blows, each one landing with the force of revelation that reshapes everything you thought you knew about your life. I found myself gripping the edge of the cafeteria table, my knuckles white with the effort of staying upright, as the implications of what Lisa was suggesting began to sink in. "That's impossible," I whispered, though even as I said it, I knew that it explained everything that had been confusing me about our financial situation over the past few months. Sarah, I need you to get home right now and look through every piece of financial documentation you can find, Lisa continued. Check your credit reports, your bank statements, anything with your name on it. And whatever you do, don't sign anything else until you've talked to an attorney who represents only you, not both of you. I sat in that courthouse cafeteria for another 10 minutes after ending the call with Lisa, staring at the cold coffee in front of me and trying to process the possibility that my entire understanding of our situation had been fundamentally wrong. The bankruptcy hearing that I had dreaded as a humiliating but necessary step toward rebuilding our lives together was beginning to look like something entirely different. A carefully orchestrated finale to a deception that had been months or years in the making. When I finally stood up to leave the courthouse, abandoning any hope that David would still appear for the 11 o'clock hearing, I walked with the gait of someone whose world had shifted beneath her feet. The woman who had entered that building 3 hours earlier, worried about financial failure but confident in her marriage and partnership, was being replaced by someone who was beginning to understand that she had been systematically betrayed by the person she trusted most in the world. The drive home to our house in Scottsdale felt surreal, as if I were traveling through a landscape that looked familiar but had been fundamentally altered in ways I was only beginning to perceive. Every landmark, every turn, every familiar sight was the same as it had been that morning, but I was seeing it all through eyes that were rapidly adjusting to a new and terrifying reality. The house that had felt like our shared sanctuary was beginning to look like a crime scene, and the life I thought we had built together was starting to reveal itself as an elaborate construction designed to hide the truth from the one person who had the most to lose when that truth finally emerged. As I pulled into our driveway and saw David's car was not there, despite his morning claim that he would be going directly from the office to the courthouse, I realized that I was about to begin the most difficult investigation of my life. I was about to discover whether the man I had loved and trusted for 6 years had been protecting our shared future or systematically destroying mine. And I was about to learn whether the financial recovery I thought we were pursuing together was actually going to require me to recover from him. Walking through the front door of what I had considered our home for the past 4 years felt like entering a museum exhibit of someone else's life. Every piece of furniture, every photograph on the walls, every carefully chosen decoration suddenly seemed foreign and suspicious, as if I were seeing them for the first time through the lens of betrayal that Lisa's phone call had placed over my vision. The leather sectional sofa where David and I had spent countless evenings planning our business strategy now looked like a prop in an elaborate performance, and the framed photo of us at our wedding seemed to mock the naive woman who had believed that love and trust were the same thing. I had met David Mitchell 6.5 years earlier at a networking event for young professionals in Phoenix, one of those awkward evening gatherings where everyone clutched business cards and tried to make meaningful connections while balancing wine glasses and small plates of appetizers. I was 25 then, fresh out of Arizona State University with a communications degree and working as a junior account coordinator for a mid-sized advertising firm downtown. The job paid barely enough to cover my student loans and rent for a tiny apartment in Tempe, but I was determined to build a career in marketing and convinced that hard work and dedication would eventually lead to the success I craved. David had approached me near the registration table, introducing himself with the kind of confident smile that seemed effortless and genuine. He was 28, 3 years older than me, with dark hair and intelligent brown eyes that gave him an approachable warmth that immediately put me at ease. He worked as an account manager for a larger firm across town, and we discovered that we shared similar frustrations with corporate bureaucracy and similar dreams of eventually starting our own agency, where creativity and client relationships would matter more than office politics and arbitrary deadlines. "You know what I hate most about working for someone else?" he had asked during our first conversation, leaning against the wall with a casual confidence that I found immediately attractive. "You do all the creative work, you build the relationships with clients, you stay late fixing problems that weren't your fault to begin with, and then someone else gets the credit and the profit when everything succeeds." I had nodded enthusiastically, recognizing my own experiences in his description and feeling the immediate connection that comes from finding someone who understands your professional struggles without requiring lengthy explanations. And when something goes wrong, suddenly it's your responsibility to fix it, even if the problem started 3 levels above you in the decision-making process, I added, drawing a laugh from him that felt warm and genuine. Our first date had been coffee on a Saturday morning, which stretched into lunch, then an afternoon walk through downtown Phoenix, and eventually dinner at a small Italian restaurant where we talked until the staff began stacking chairs around us. David was easy to talk to, intellectually curious without being pretentious, and ambitious in ways that seemed to complement my own career goals rather than compete with them. He asked thoughtful questions about my work, my family, my interests outside of marketing, and he listened to my answers with the kind of focused attention that made me feel genuinely heard and valued. "I think most people get into marketing for the wrong reasons," he had said over our second bottle of wine that evening. "They think it's about manipulation or convincing people to buy things they don't need. But I think the best marketing is really about helping businesses connect with customers who genuinely need what they're offering. It's about communication and relationship building, not tricks or gimmicks." I remember being impressed by his philosophy, which aligned perfectly with my own beliefs about ethical business practices and the importance of building authentic connections between brands and consumers. Looking back now, I realize that his ability to articulate exactly what I wanted to hear should have been more concerning than reassuring. But at 25, I interpreted his seemingly perfect compatibility with my values as evidence that we were meant to build something together. Our relationship developed quickly but naturally, with shared interests and complementary skills that made spending time together feel effortless and productive. David was more experienced in client relations and business development, while I had stronger creative instincts and a better understanding of digital marketing trends that were beginning to reshape the industry. We spent weekends working on freelance projects together, taking on small clients that our respective employers didn't consider worth their time, and gradually building a portfolio that demonstrated our potential as a team. "We should start keeping track of our combined billing hours," David suggested about 6 months into our relationship as we sat in my apartment working on a website redesign for a local restaurant. "I think we're already making enough on side projects to cover your rent, and probably mine too if we were more strategic about pursuing bigger clients." The idea of leaving the security of regular employment to start our own agency was both thrilling and terrifying. But David's confidence made it seem not just possible but inevitable. He had already begun developing a business plan, researching office spaces, and calculating the financial requirements for establishing a legitimate marketing firm rather than just continuing to freelance from our apartments. His enthusiasm was infectious, and his practical approach to planning made the dream feel achievable rather than recklessly optimistic. "I've been thinking about names," he said one evening as we walked through Old Town Scottsdale after dinner. "Something that sounds professional but not pretentious, memorable but not gimmicky. What do you think about Mitchell Communications? Or maybe Mitchell Marketing Solutions?" I had laughed at his suggestions, not from mockery but from surprise at his assumption that the business would bear only his name. "What about Mitchell and Morrison Marketing?" I suggested, using my maiden name since we weren't yet married. "Or Phoenix Creative Solutions, or something that reflects both of our contributions, rather than just one person." David had paused on the sidewalk, his expression shifting to something that I interpreted as consideration, but now recognize as calculation. "You're right, of course," he said after a moment. "Partnership means partnership. We should both be represented equally in whatever we build together." It was during this period of planning and dreaming about our shared business that David introduced me to Rebecca Chang, a woman 5 years older than both of us, who had recently moved to Phoenix from Seattle after completing her MBA at the University of Washington. Rebecca was sophisticated in ways that I envied, with an effortless professional style and a command of business terminology that made her seem like she belonged in corner offices and boardrooms. She had worked for several major corporations in marketing and business development roles, and she possessed the kind of financial acumen that David and I recognized we would need to transform our freelance work into a legitimate business. "Rebecca understands the operational side of running an agency in ways that we don't," David explained when he first suggested that we consider bringing her on as a partner rather than just a consultant. "She knows about business licenses, tax structures, insurance requirements, client contracts, all the administrative details that could sink us if we get them wrong." I had been hesitant about bringing a third person into what I had envisioned as our shared venture, but I couldn't argue with the practical benefits that Rebecca's experience would provide. During our first formal meeting at a coffee shop in downtown Phoenix, She had presented a detailed analysis of the local marketing industry, identifying gaps in the market that a small agency could exploit, and outlining a growth strategy that seemed both ambitious and realistic. The key is to establish credibility quickly, Rebecca had explained, spreading spreadsheets and market research across our small table. You need office space that projects success, professional marketing materials that demonstrate your capabilities, and a client roster that proves you can deliver results. The challenge is funding these investments before you have the revenue to support them. Rebecca's solution was to structure the business as a three-way partnership, with each of us contributing different resources toward the startup costs and ongoing operations. David and I would provide the creative and client-facing expertise, while Rebecca would handle business operations and provide the initial capital needed for office space, equipment, and marketing materials. The arrangement seemed equitable and practical, allowing us to launch with professional credibility, rather than trying to build slowly from our apartments. I'm thinking we call it Mitchell & Chang Marketing Solutions, Rebecca suggested during our second meeting. It has a nice professional sound, and it reflects the partnership structure without being too complicated or confusing for clients. I remember feeling a slight pang of disappointment that my name wasn't included in the business title, but I rationalized the decision by telling myself that branding was less important than building a successful company where all three of us could thrive. David seemed comfortable with the name choice, and Rebecca's financial contributions were substantial enough that I felt it would be petty to insist on equal naming rights when I wasn't providing equal startup capital. The first year of Mitchell & Chang Marketing Solutions exceeded all of our optimistic projections, with a combination of clients that David and I brought from our freelance work and new accounts that Rebecca's business connections helped us secure. We rented a modern office space in a professional building near downtown Phoenix, hired 2 junior account coordinators, and invested in the kind of technology and software that allowed us to compete with much larger agencies for mid-size clients. I threw myself into the creative work with the passion of someone who had finally found her calling, developing campaigns that won industry recognition and built genuine excitement among our clients about their marketing results. David proved to be an excellent account manager, building strong relationships with clients and ensuring that our service delivery consistently exceeded expectations. Rebecca managed the financial and operational aspects of the business with impressive efficiency, allowing David and me to focus on what we did best without worrying about the administrative details that had seemed so overwhelming when we were planning the company. We're on track to hit $300,000 in revenue this year, Rebecca announced during one of our quarterly partner meetings, presenting financial reports that showed steady growth across all client categories. If we maintain this trajectory, we'll be able to expand to 10 employees next year and start pursuing some of the larger corporate accounts that we've been building toward. The success was intoxicating, validating every risk we had taken and leaving secure employment to build something of our own. I worked longer hours than I ever had as an employee, but the work felt meaningful in ways that my previous job never had. Every successful campaign, every satisfied client, every piece of positive feedback felt like evidence that we had created something valuable and sustainable. It was during our second year of operation that I began to notice subtle changes in the dynamic between David and Rebecca that made me slightly uncomfortable, though I couldn't articulate exactly what was bothering me. They seemed to communicate with a level of understanding that sometimes excluded me from conversations about business strategy and financial planning. Rebecca would reference discussions that she and David had apparently had privately, and David would defer to her judgment on operational matters without the collaborative discussion that I had expected from our partnership. Rebecca thinks we should consider taking on some larger retainer clients, David would say during our weekly planning meetings, presenting ideas that had clearly been developed before our conversation began. She's identified some opportunities that could significantly increase our monthly recurring revenue. I found myself asking questions like, when did you and Rebecca discuss this? Or what other options did you consider before deciding on this approach? Not because I disagreed with their conclusions, but because I felt excluded from the decision-making process that I had expected to be collaborative. David's responses were always reasonable and non-defensive, but they confirmed that he and Rebecca were having strategic conversations that happened outside of our formal partnership meetings. Rebecca has more experience with this type of business development, he would explain. It makes sense for us to work through the preliminary analysis before bringing ideas to you, so we're not wasting time on options that aren't financially viable. The logic was sound, but it created a pattern where I was increasingly relegated to implementing decisions that had been made by the two people who controlled the business's financial and strategic direction. My creative work remained valued and essential, but I began to feel like a highly paid employee rather than an equal partner in the company we had built together. During our third year, David and I got married in a ceremony that felt like the culmination of both our personal and professional partnership. Rebecca served as my maid of honor, having become not just a business partner, but one of my closest friends in Phoenix. The wedding was small and elegant, held at a resort in Sedona, with 40 guests who represented the community we had built around our shared life and work. To Sarah and David, Rebecca had said in her toast at the reception, who prove that the best business partnerships are built on the same foundation as the best marriages: trust, communication, and shared commitment to something bigger than yourselves. I had been moved by her words, interpreting them as validation that our unusual combination of marriage and business partnership was sustainable and healthy. Looking back, I wonder whether Rebecca's toast was sincere celebration or something more calculated, designed to reinforce the narrative that kept me comfortable with arrangements that were gradually shifting control away from me. Our fourth year was marked by continued growth and increasing complexity in our client relationships and business operations. We moved to a larger office space, expanded our team to 8 employees, and began pursuing the corporate accounts that Rebecca had identified as our long-term growth strategy. I was promoted to creative director, a title that reflected my leadership role in developing and executing client campaigns, while David became director of client relations, and Rebecca maintained her role as director of operations and finance. "I think it's time for us to formalize our partnership structure," Rebecca suggested during a quarterly meeting that fall. "We've grown beyond the informal arrangement we started with, and we need legal documentation that protects all of our interests and clarifies our respective responsibilities." The partnership agreement that Rebecca's attorney drafted was complex and detailed, covering everything from profit distribution to decision-making authority to procedures for resolving disputes between partners. I remember feeling overwhelmed by the legal language and grateful when David offered to review the document thoroughly and explain any provisions that seemed unclear or problematic. "It's mostly standard business partnership language," he assured me, after spending several hours with the contract. "The important thing is that it protects all 3 of us equally and ensures that we can continue operating efficiently without getting bogged down in bureaucratic procedures every time we need to make a business decision." I signed the partnership agreement without fully understanding several key provisions that would later prove crucial to my situation. The document established Rebecca and David as managing partners with enhanced decision-making authority, while designating me as a creative partner with guaranteed input on campaigns and client relationships, but limited involvement in financial and operational decisions. At the time, the distinction seemed to reflect our respective strengths and interests, rather than a hierarchy that placed me in a subordinate position. Our 5th year began with our most successful quarter to date and ambitious plans for expansion that would have doubled our employee count and opened a second office in Tucson. I was working on the largest campaign of my career, a comprehensive rebranding project for a regional retail chain that represented nearly 40% of our annual revenue. The project required months of market research, creative development, and strategic planning, and its success would establish our agency as a serious competitor for major corporate accounts throughout the Southwest. It was during this period of intense work and optimistic growth planning that I began to notice financial irregularities that didn't make sense given our apparent success. Quarterly profit distributions that had been consistent and generous suddenly became smaller and less predictable, with explanations about unexpected expenses and necessary reinvestments that Rebecca presented with her usual professional confidence, but that seemed to contradict the revenue reports she had previously shared with us. "We're investing heavily in the infrastructure needed to support our expansion," she explained when I asked about the reduced profit sharing. "It's better to fund growth from current revenue rather than taking on debt that would limit our flexibility going forward." David supported Rebecca's explanations and seemed unconcerned about the changes in our financial situation, which made me feel unreasonable for questioning business decisions that were clearly outside my area of expertise. I focused on my creative work and trusted that my partners were managing the financial aspects of our business with the same competence they had demonstrated for the previous 4 years. It was only when Rebecca announced that we would need to scale back our expansion plans due to, quote, "unexpected market conditions," that I began to seriously question whether something was wrong with our financial situation. The explanation came during a partnership meeting in late summer, delivered with the kind of professional composure that made it difficult to challenge without seeming emotional or irrational. Several of our major clients have indicated that they'll be reducing their marketing budgets for the remainder of the year, Rebecca reported, presenting spreadsheets that showed projected revenue shortfalls across multiple accounts. We need to adjust our growth timeline and focus on maintaining our current operations rather than expanding too quickly in an uncertain market. The news was disappointing, but not unprecedented in an industry where client budgets could shift unexpectedly based on their own financial pressures. What bothered me was that I hadn't heard any indication of budget concerns from the clients I worked with directly, and the market conditions that Rebecca described didn't match the industry reports I read or the experiences of other agency owners I knew through professional organizations. Which clients specifically have mentioned budget cuts? I asked during the meeting, hoping to understand how the reductions might affect the campaigns I was currently managing. David and Rebecca exchanged a look that lasted just long enough to make me notice, before Rebecca responded with general references to several retail accounts and some of the smaller service industry clients, without providing the specific details that I would have expected from someone who managed our financial relationships so meticulously. The conversation moved quickly to operational adjustments we would need to make, including reducing our office space, delaying equipment purchases, and postponing the hiring of additional staff that we had planned for the fall. The decisions were presented as temporary measures to weather a difficult period, and both David and Rebecca expressed confidence that we would resume our growth trajectory once market conditions improved. Over the following months, I began to pay closer attention to details that I had previously trusted my partners to handle, not from suspicion, but from a growing sense that I needed to better understand the business aspects of our agency in order to contribute more effectively to strategic decisions. I started reviewing client communications more carefully, paying attention to budget discussions and contract renewals that had previously been handled primarily by David and Rebecca. What I discovered was that our clients seemed generally satisfied with our services and showed no signs of the financial pressures that supposedly required them to reduce their marketing investments. Several clients actually expressed interest in expanding their campaigns, and new business inquiries continued at a pace that seemed inconsistent with the market downturn that Rebecca had described. I think there might be some confusion about the Johnson account, I mentioned to David one evening as we worked late in the office. I had lunch with their marketing director yesterday, and she seemed excited about increasing their digital advertising budget for the holiday season. But the financial reports show them as one of the accounts that's cutting spending. David looked up from his computer with an expression of mild annoyance that I had learned to recognize as his response to being questioned about business matters that he considered outside my responsibility. Rebecca handles the contract negotiations and budget approvals, he replied. The client might be interested in expansion, but that doesn't mean they have the approved budget to actually move forward with additional services. His explanation was reasonable, but it highlighted the gap between my direct client relationships and the financial arrangements that governed our actual business operations. I was building trust and generating enthusiasm among clients, but Rebecca controlled the contracts and revenue that determined our company's success. David managed the day-to-day client communications, but the strategic decisions that shaped our long-term growth were made in conversations that I was increasingly excluded from. As winter approached and our supposed financial difficulties continued, I noticed that David and Rebecca were spending more time together outside of normal business hours, working on what they described as restructuring plans and cost reduction strategies. They would arrive at the office early for private meetings and stay late for discussions that they said would be more productive, without the distraction of trying to include everyone in preliminary brainstorming sessions. We're trying to work through some complex financial modeling, David explained when I asked about being included in their planning sessions. It's mostly number crunching and scenario analysis that would be tedious for you, and probably not the best use of your time when you're managing such important client projects. I accepted his explanation because I trusted him, and because I genuinely was overwhelmed with creative work that felt more meaningful and engaging than financial planning. But I also began to feel increasingly isolated from the strategic direction of the business that I had helped create, and that represented not just my career but my financial future. The isolation became more pronounced during our holiday party in December, when I overheard a conversation between David and Rebecca that made me question whether the financial challenges they had described were as severe as they had led me to believe. They were standing near the bar, speaking quietly but not quietly enough to prevent me from hearing Rebecca mention offshore accounts and asset protection strategies, in a context that seemed inconsistent with a business that was struggling to maintain its current operations. When I approached them to join the conversation, they immediately shifted to discussing client holiday gifts and vacation schedules, leaving me with the uncomfortable feeling that I had heard something that I wasn't supposed to know about. I tried to dismiss the feeling as paranoia brought on by stress and overwork, but it was the first time I had seriously considered the possibility that David and Rebecca might be keeping important information from me. The new year brought what Rebecca described as a temporary cash flow crisis that would require immediate action to prevent serious financial damage to the company. The crisis was presented as the result of several clients delaying payments and unexpected tax obligations that had been larger than anticipated, creating a situation where we needed to reduce expenses quickly to maintain our credit and reputation. We need to consider whether maintaining our current office space is sustainable, Rebecca announced during an emergency partnership meeting in January. The lease renewal is coming up in March, and the landlord is requiring a significant increase that we may not be able to afford given our current financial position. The prospect of losing our professional office space and potentially having to work from home or a much smaller location felt like a devastating blow to the progress we had made over 5 years. I had invested enormous amounts of time and energy in building our agency's reputation and professional credibility, and the idea of taking such a dramatic step backward was almost unbearable. What are our other options? I asked, hoping that Rebecca's financial expertise could identify alternatives that would allow us to maintain our professional presence while addressing whatever cash flow problems we were experiencing. We could consider bringing in an investor, David suggested, but that would mean giving up some control over business decisions and profit distribution. Or we could pursue a line of credit, but that would require personal guarantees from all the partners and could put our personal assets at risk if the business situation doesn't improve quickly. Rebecca nodded in agreement with David's assessment, adding that she had already begun exploring both options, but that neither was particularly attractive, given the uncertainty about when our financial situation might stabilize. The conversation concluded with an agreement that we would spend the next few weeks investigating all possible alternatives before making any irreversible decisions about our office space or business structure. It was during this period of uncertainty and stress that I made the decision to consult with my sister Lisa about our situation, not because I suspected any wrongdoing, but because I wanted an objective perspective on our options from someone with legal experience who wasn't emotionally invested in the outcome. Lisa had always been protective of me and skeptical of financial arrangements that seemed too complex or too good to be true, and I valued her practical advice even when it wasn't what I wanted to hear. "Something about this doesn't sound right," Lisa said after I described our financial situation and the various solutions that David and Rebecca had proposed. "If you're generating the revenue you described, and if your clients are as satisfied as you indicated, there shouldn't be sudden cash flow problems that require drastic action. Either your partners aren't telling you the whole truth about the business finances, or they're not telling you the whole truth about their plans for the business." Lisa's suspicions seemed unfounded and unfair, based on general skepticism rather than specific knowledge of our situation, and I initially dismissed her concerns as the overprotectiveness of a younger sister who had never fully trusted David's motives in our relationship. But her questions planted seeds of doubt that grew stronger as I began to pay more attention to the discrepancies between what I was told about our financial situation and what I could observe about our actual business operations. The confrontation that would change everything began with a simple request for information that should have been routine and transparent. I asked Rebecca for copies of our recent financial statements and tax returns, explaining that I wanted to better understand our situation so that I could contribute more effectively to finding solutions. Her response was evasive and defensive in ways that immediately heightened my suspicions about what she might be hiding. "The financial documents are quite complex," she replied, "and they might be confusing without the context of ongoing negotiations and pending contract changes. It would probably be more productive for us to schedule a time to review everything together, so I can explain the various factors that affect our current position." I pressed for immediate access to the documents, explaining that I was entitled to full financial transparency as a partner in the business, and that I needed to understand our situation in order to make informed decisions about our future. Rebecca's continued resistance and David's support for her position created the first serious conflict in our 5-year business relationship, and forced me to acknowledge that my partners were actively preventing me from accessing information about my own company. The argument that followed revealed the extent to which I had been excluded from financial decision-making, and the degree to which David and Rebecca had been operating the business according to their own agenda rather than our supposed partnership. When I finally demanded complete financial records and threatened to consult with an attorney if they continued to refuse, Rebecca made the decision that would expose everything they had been hiding. "Fine," she said, her professional composure finally cracking under pressure. "But when you see these documents, you'll understand why we've been trying to protect you from information that would only cause unnecessary stress and anxiety." The financial records that Rebecca reluctantly provided revealed a business that bore no resemblance to the struggling agency that had been described to me over the previous 6 months. Far from experiencing cash flow problems and client losses, Mitchell & Chang Marketing Solutions was generating record revenue and maintaining healthy profit margins that should have resulted in substantial year-end distributions to all partners. The discrepancy between our actual financial performance and the crisis that Rebecca had described was so stark that I initially assumed there had been some mistake in the documents she had provided. But as I studied the records more carefully, I began to understand that the crisis was real, but not in the way that had been explained to me. The crisis was that David and Rebecca had been systematically diverting funds from the business for purposes that were not disclosed in any of the partnership documentation that I had been given access to. The revelation that my business partners had been deceiving me about our financial situation was devastating enough, but it was only the beginning of discovering the full extent of the conspiracy that had been developing around me for months or perhaps years. As I continued investigating our business records and comparing them to the information I had been given during our partnership meetings, I began to realize that the bankruptcy filing that David and I were supposedly pursuing together was not actually a joint action to resolve shared debt, but rather an elaborate scheme to transfer our business assets while leaving me personally responsible for obligations that I had never agreed to assume. The woman who had been working 18-hour days to build what she believed was our shared business was discovering that she had actually been working to fund a conspiracy designed to destroy her financially while enriching the people she trusted most. And the bankruptcy hearing that I had dreaded as a humiliating acknowledgement of business failure was beginning to look like the final step in a plan that would leave me with nothing, while allowing David and Rebecca to continue their partnership without the burden of including me in the profits they had been generating with my labor. The morning after I discovered the true financial records of Mitchell & Chang Marketing Solutions, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by spreadsheets, bank statements, and partnership documents that painted a picture of systematic deception that was far more elaborate than I had initially comprehended. The coffee in my mug had grown cold hours earlier, but I couldn't bring myself to move from the table where I had been trying to piece together a timeline of when the betrayal had begun and how extensively I had been excluded from decisions about my own financial future. David had left for the office before dawn, claiming he needed to prepare for an important client presentation, but his absence gave me the uninterrupted time I needed to examine documents that revealed discrepancies I should have noticed months earlier. The company that Rebecca had described as struggling with cash flow problems had actually deposited over $200,000 in revenue during the previous quarter alone, money that should have generated substantial profit distributions to all 3 partners, but that had somehow disappeared into accounts and investments that were not reflected in any of the financial reports I had been shown. The most disturbing discovery was a series of wire transfers from our business operating account to what appeared to be offshore banking institutions, transactions that had been authorized by David and Rebecca without my knowledge or signature, despite the partnership agreement that supposedly required unanimous consent for any transfer exceeding $10,000. The transfers were disguised in our accounting records as payments to consulting firms and professional service providers. But when I researched the supposed recipients, I found that several of the companies either didn't exist or had no legitimate business relationship with our agency. I spent the entire morning calling banks, researching corporate registrations, and cross-referencing financial documents with the contracts and agreements that I had signed over the previous 5 years. Each phone call and each document review, revealed new layers of deception that made me question not just David and Rebecca's recent behavior, but every major business decision that had been made since we established the partnership. The woman who had trusted completely in the financial management of her business partners was discovering that her trust had been systematically exploited to fund what appeared to be their personal enrichment at her expense. When David returned home that evening, I was waiting for him in our living room with printed copies of bank statements, wire transfer authorizations, and partnership agreements spread across the coffee table between us. His expression when he saw the documents was not surprise or confusion, but the careful neutrality of someone who had been expecting this confrontation and had prepared his responses in advance. "We need to talk about these financial records," I said, holding up a bank statement that showed transfers to accounts I had never heard of. "I need you to explain why money is leaving our business without my knowledge, and why the financial situation you and Rebecca have described to me bears no resemblance to our actual revenue and expenses." David sat down across from me with the measured calm of someone who had rehearsed this conversation, though his hands betrayed his nervousness as he reached for the documents I had arranged on the table. "Sarah, I know this looks concerning, but you're not seeing the complete picture," he began, his voice taking on the patient tone he used when explaining complex client strategies. "Rebecca has been managing some sophisticated financial planning that requires moving money between different accounts and investment vehicles to maximize our tax advantages and protect our assets." "Protect our assets from what?" I asked, spreading out additional pages that showed a pattern of transfers that had been occurring for over 18 months. "And why wasn't I informed about financial planning that involves hundreds of thousands of dollars in business funds? According to our partnership agreement, I should have been consulted about any significant financial decisions, not just informed about them after the fact." David's explanation became increasingly convoluted, as he tried to justify financial arrangements that seemed designed to obscure, rather than optimize our business operations. He spoke about tax shelters and asset protection strategies, with terminology that sounded authoritative but didn't address the fundamental question of why these decisions had been made without my knowledge or consent. When I pressed for specific details about where our money had been moved and why, his responses became vague and defensive. "Rebecca has an MBA and years of experience with corporate financial management," he said, his voice carrying a slight edge of irritation that I was questioning business decisions that were supposedly beyond my expertise. "She's been trying to position us for long-term growth and financial stability, but these strategies require confidentiality and flexibility that wouldn't be possible if we had to explain every detail to all three partners every time we needed to move money or restructure our investments." The conversation continued for over 2 hours, with David providing explanations that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify the situation, and my questions becoming more pointed as I realized that he had no intention of providing honest answers about what had been done with business funds that legally belonged to all three partners. When I finally demanded that he schedule an immediate meeting with Rebecca to review all financial records and account access, his careful composure began to crack. "You're being paranoid and unreasonable," he said, standing up abruptly and beginning to pace around our living room. "Rebecca and I have been working 18-hour days to save this business from bankruptcy, and instead of being grateful for everything we've done to protect your interests, you're acting like we're criminals who have been plotting against you. If you've been working to save the business from bankruptcy, then why do our actual revenue reports show record profits?" I asked, holding up the financial statements that contradicted everything I had been told about our situation. "And if you've been protecting my interests, then why have I been excluded from every major financial decision for the past year?" David's response was to accuse me of being emotional and irrational, suggesting that the stress of running a business was affecting my judgment, and that I was misinterpreting routine financial management as evidence of conspiracy. His accusations were delivered with the kind of calm authority that would have been convincing if I hadn't been holding documentary evidence that contradicted his claims, but the gaslighting techniques that might have worked in the past were no longer effective against someone who had actual financial records to reference. The argument escalated until David stormed out of the house, claiming that he needed space to think about how to handle my, quote, destructive paranoia, and suggesting that my behavior was threatening the stability of both our marriage and our business. I spent that night alone in our house, reviewing documents and making phone calls to financial institutions, trying to understand the full scope of what had been done without my knowledge, and what legal options might be available to protect whatever assets remained in my name. The next morning brought a phone call from Rebecca that confirmed my worst suspicions about the coordination between my business partners. Instead of expressing surprise or concern about the financial irregularities I had discovered, she immediately began explaining why my access to certain business accounts needed to be temporarily restricted, while she and David worked to resolve what she described as, quote, immediate attention. "Sarah, I understand that you're upset about being excluded from some recent financial decisions," Rebecca said, her voice carrying the same professional calm that had always made her seem trustworthy and competent. "But you need to understand that David and I have been trying to protect you from legal exposure that could result in personal liability for business debts that you never agreed to assume." "What legal exposure?" I demanded, recognizing that Rebecca was introducing new information that had never been mentioned during any of our previous discussions about the business's financial situation. "What business debts are you referring to, and why would I have personal liability for obligations that should be covered by our corporate structure?" Rebecca's explanation revealed another layer of deception that made the financial transfers seem almost minor by comparison. According to her account, our business had accumulated substantial debts to vendors and service providers that exceeded our available credit and cash reserves, creating potential personal liability for all partners under the terms of our partnership agreement. The debts had been hidden from me, she claimed, because David and she had been working to negotiate settlements and payment plans that would resolve the obligations without requiring contributions from partners who weren't involved in creating the problems. "We've been trying to handle this quietly and efficiently," Rebecca continued, "but the situation has reached a point where we need to consider more drastic measures to protect everyone's personal assets from business creditors. Bankruptcy might be our only option to discharge these debts without destroying your personal financial security." The word bankruptcy hit me like a physical blow, not just because of the financial implications, but because it represented the destruction of everything I had worked to build over the previous 5 years. The business that had been my primary source of income, professional identity, and creative fulfillment was apparently so deeply in debt that liquidation was the only viable option, and I was learning about this crisis through a phone call rather than through the collaborative discussion that our partnership should have required. "Why wasn't I informed about these debts when they were accumulating?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady despite the panic that was beginning to overwhelm my ability to think clearly. "Why wasn't I included in the negotiations with creditors, and why are you and David making decisions about bankruptcy without consulting me about alternatives?" Rebecca's response was that the debts had accumulated gradually over several months as a result of clients delaying payments and unexpected expenses that had exceeded our normal operating budget. She and David had initially believed that the problems could be resolved through better cash flow management and more aggressive collection efforts. But the situation had deteriorated to the point where bankruptcy was now the only realistic option for protecting our personal assets from business creditors. "We've already consulted with a bankruptcy attorney who specializes in small business restructuring," she explained. "Robert Hayes has extensive experience with cases like ours, and he's confident that we can discharge the business debts through Chapter 7 bankruptcy, while protecting your personal assets and giving you a fresh start financially." The mention of Robert Hayes, the bankruptcy attorney who had supposedly been guiding us through the legal process, was the first time I learned that David and Rebecca had been consulting with legal counsel about our situation. The discovery that they had been planning for bankruptcy while telling me that we were working to resolve temporary cash flow problems felt like another betrayal, evidence that I had been systematically excluded from decisions that would determine my financial future. Over the following days, I insisted on meeting directly with Robert Hayes to understand the bankruptcy process and my options for protecting whatever assets remained in my name. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon at his office in downtown Phoenix, and I arrived prepared with questions about how bankruptcy would affect my personal credit, my ownership stake in the business, and my liability for debts that I had not been aware of when they were incurred. Robert Hayes was a man in his 50s with gray hair, and the kind of professional demeanor that inspired confidence in his competence and discretion. His office was furnished with expensive wood furniture and law books that created an atmosphere of serious legal expertise, and his manner was both sympathetic and authoritative as he explained the bankruptcy process and the protections it would provide for people in my situation. Chapter 7 bankruptcy will allow you to discharge business debts that exceed your ability to pay while protecting your personal assets from creditors, he explained, reviewing documents that David and Rebecca had apparently provided to him during previous consultations. The process typically takes 4 to 6 months, and at the conclusion, you'll be legally free from any obligation to pay debts that were incurred by the business prior to the filing date. I asked detailed questions about how the bankruptcy would be structured, which debts would be included, and what documentation would be required to prove that I had not been involved in creating the financial obligations that necessitated the filing. Robert's answers were thorough and professional, but they revealed that David and Rebecca had provided him with a version of our business's financial history that differed significantly from what I had discovered in my own investigation. According to the records I've been provided, Robert said, consulting a thick file of documents, the business accumulated approximately $450,000 in debt over the past 18 months, as a result of declining revenue and increasing operating expenses. The debt includes unpaid vendor invoices, outstanding loans, and tax obligations that exceed the business's liquid assets and available credit. That doesn't match the financial records I've reviewed, I replied, pulling out copies of bank statements and revenue reports that showed consistent profitability throughout the period when debts were supposedly accumulating. Our business has been generating substantial revenue and should have been able to cover normal operating expenses without accumulating debt of that magnitude. Robert's expression shifted as he compared the documents I had brought with the records in his file, and I could see him recognizing discrepancies that raised questions about the information he had been given by David and Rebecca. His professional composure remained intact, but his questions became more pointed as he tried to reconcile the conflicting versions of our business's financial situation. "Mrs. Mitchell, have you been involved in the day-to-day financial management of the business?" he asked, his tone suggesting that he was beginning to suspect that he had not been given complete or accurate information about our situation. "Have you reviewed all bank statements, tax returns, and financial contracts that would show the true scope of the business's assets and liabilities?" I explained that David and Rebecca had handled most financial management while I focused on creative work and client relationships, but that my recent investigation had revealed substantial revenue and assets that were not reflected in the financial crisis they had described. I provided Robert with copies of bank statements, wire transfer records, and revenue reports that painted a picture of a profitable business, rather than one that was facing imminent bankruptcy. The meeting concluded with Robert requesting additional documentation from David and Rebecca to clarify the discrepancies in the financial records, and his suggestion that I might want to consult with an independent attorney who could represent my interests separately from those of my business partners. His recommendation for separate legal representation was the first indication from a professional that my situation might require protection from the very people who were supposedly helping me navigate our shared financial crisis. That evening, I confronted David about the discrepancies that Robert Hayes had identified and demanded a complete explanation of how our supposedly profitable business had accumulated debts that required bankruptcy protection. David's response was to accuse me of undermining the legal strategy that was designed to protect all three partners, and to suggest that my insistence on questioning every detail was jeopardizing our ability to resolve the situation efficiently. "Robert knows what he's doing, and Rebecca has provided him with all the information he needs to handle our case properly," David said, his voice carrying the frustrated tone of someone who was tired of being questioned about decisions that he considered final. "Your job is to cooperate with the process, not to second-guess every aspect of the legal strategy that's been developed by people who actually understand bankruptcy law." "My job is to protect my own interests," I replied, "and right now it appears that my interests are not aligned with whatever strategy you and Rebecca have developed without my input. I'm going to hire my own attorney to review this situation independently, and I'm not signing any bankruptcy documents until I understand exactly what debts I'm supposedly responsible for and how they were incurred." David's reaction to my declaration of independence was immediate and hostile, with accusations that I was being selfish and destructive at a time when cooperation was essential for protecting everyone's financial security. He claimed that my decision to hire separate legal representation would complicate the bankruptcy process and potentially expose all three partners to additional legal liability that could have been avoided through the unified approach that Robert Hayes had recommended. The argument continued for hours, with David alternating between attempts to convince me that I was misunderstanding the situation and threats about the consequences of refusing to cooperate with the bankruptcy filing that had apparently already been prepared on my behalf. His behavior was so different from the supportive partner I had known for 6 years that I began to question whether the man I had married had ever been genuine, or whether I had been living with someone who was capable of elaborate deception when it served his interests. The next morning brought a phone call from Lisa, who had been researching the attorneys and financial advisors that I might need to protect myself from what was increasingly looking like a coordinated attempt to destroy my financial security. Her research had uncovered information about both Robert Hayes and Rebecca Chang that raised serious questions about their credibility and their potential motivations in handling my case. "Sarah, I think you need to know that Robert Hayes has been disciplined by the State Bar Association for financial irregularities in previous bankruptcy cases," Lisa said, her voice urgent with concern. "And Rebecca Chang has been involved in at least 2 other business partnerships that ended with one partner filing for bankruptcy, while the others continued operating under different corporate structures." The information that Lisa had discovered suggested that both Robert Hayes and Rebecca Chang had experience with bankruptcy strategies that might be designed to benefit some parties at the expense of others, rather than providing equal protection for all partners as I had been told. The possibility that I was not just a victim of poor business management, but the target of a deliberate scheme to transfer business assets while leaving me with personal liability was becoming difficult to ignore. I spent the following week consulting with James Thompson, a forensic accountant that Lisa had recommended, who specialized in analyzing financial records for evidence of fraud or misappropriation of assets. James's investigation revealed that the offshore transfers I had discovered were only part of a much more sophisticated scheme to move business assets into accounts and investments that were controlled by David and Rebecca without my knowledge or access. "Your business partners have been systematically transferring funds to entities that they control personally," James explained during our meeting at his office, spreading financial documents across his conference table. "The transfers have been structured to look like legitimate business expenses, but when you trace the money to its final destination, it's clear that the funds are not being used for business purposes and are not accessible to you as a partner in the company." James's analysis showed that over $600,000 had been moved from business accounts over the previous 2 years, funds that should have been reflected in profit distributions to all partners, but that had instead been diverted to investments and accounts that benefited only David and Rebecca. The sophistication of the scheme suggested months or years of planning, and the timing of the transfers indicated that the bankruptcy filing was intended to eliminate my ability to recover assets that had been systematically stolen from the business we had built together. The bankruptcy filing that they're proposing would discharge your personal liability for the fabricated debts they've created, but it would also prevent you from pursuing legal action to recover the assets they've diverted, James continued. "By the time the bankruptcy process is complete, the money they've stolen will be safely protected in offshore accounts and investment vehicles that would be extremely difficult and expensive to pursue through international legal proceedings." The revelation that my husband and business partner had been planning for years to destroy my financial security while protecting their own was devastating in ways that I struggled to comprehend. The woman who had worked 18-hour days to build what she believed was our shared success was discovering that her labor had been funding a conspiracy designed to leave her with nothing, while allowing the people she trusted most to continue their partnership without her. As the date for our bankruptcy hearing approached, David and Rebecca increased their pressure on me to sign the necessary documents and cooperate with the legal process that they claimed was our only option for resolving our financial crisis. Their arguments became more desperate and their threats more explicit, with warnings about the legal consequences of refusing to participate in bankruptcy proceedings that had already been filed on my behalf. "You're going to destroy all 3 of us if you don't stop this destructive behavior," Rebecca said during what would be our final conversation before the hearing. "Robert has already filed the initial paperwork, and if you refuse to appear or if you contradict the financial information we've provided, you could face criminal charges for bankruptcy fraud." The threat of criminal prosecution was clearly intended to frighten me into compliance, but it also revealed how desperate David and Rebecca had become to prevent me from exposing their scheme to judicial scrutiny. Their willingness to threaten me with false criminal charges demonstrated that they understood the vulnerability of their position if the truth about our business's finances became public during the bankruptcy proceedings. On the Sunday evening before our scheduled Tuesday morning hearing, I made the decision that would determine the outcome of this entire conspiracy. Instead of signing the bankruptcy documents that David and Rebecca had prepared, I contacted Monica Williams, the divorce attorney that Lisa had recommended, and retained her to represent my interests, independently of whatever legal strategy my business partners had developed. Monica's immediate advice was to refuse to participate in any bankruptcy proceeding until we had conducted a thorough investigation of the business's actual financial condition and identified all assets that might be recoverable through legal action. She also recommended that I begin documenting every conversation and every document related to the bankruptcy filing, as evidence that might be crucial for both criminal prosecution and civil recovery of the assets that had been diverted from our business. Your husband and business partner have been planning this for a long time, Monica explained during our emergency Sunday evening consultation. But they've made the mistake of assuming that you would cooperate with their scheme without questioning the financial information they've provided. Tomorrow's hearing is going to be their moment of maximum vulnerability, because they'll be required to provide sworn testimony about the business's finances under circumstances where perjury carries serious criminal penalties. As I prepared for what I now understood would be a confrontation rather than a cooperative legal proceeding, I realized that my entire life for the previous several years had been constructed around lies that were designed to position me for this ultimate betrayal. The bankruptcy hearing that David claimed was necessary to protect our shared interests was actually intended to complete the transfer of assets that had been occurring gradually for months or years, leaving me legally barred from recovering money that had been systematically stolen from the business I had helped create. The woman who had trusted completely in the partnership she thought she shared with her husband was about to discover that trust and partnership were incompatible with the kind of calculated deception that David and Rebecca had been practicing. And the financial recovery that I thought we were pursuing together was about to require me to recover from the very people who had promised to stand by me through our most difficult challenges. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that makes every detail seem sharper and more significant than usual, as if the universe had adjusted its focus to ensure that nothing about this day would be missed or forgotten. I dressed in my most professional navy suit, the one I had worn to our most important client presentations. But this time I was preparing for a performance that would determine whether I emerged from this courtroom as a victim or as someone who had successfully fought back against a conspiracy designed to destroy her financially. Monica Williams arrived at my house at 7:30. Accompanied by James Thompson and another man I hadn't met before, Michael Torres, who introduced himself as a financial crimes investigator, with experience in asset recovery and bankruptcy fraud. The three of them moved with the efficient coordination of a team that had worked together on similar cases, carrying briefcases and file boxes that contained what Monica described as, quote, enough evidence to bury David and Rebecca so deep they'll need an archaeological expedition to find their way out. Sarah, I want you to understand exactly what's going to happen in that courtroom today, Monica said as we sat around my kitchen table, surrounded by documents that represented weeks of investigation into the financial conspiracy that had been constructed around me. David and Rebecca are expecting you to appear alone, confused, and compliant with whatever bankruptcy strategy they've developed. Instead, you're going to arrive with a legal team that has documentation of every fraudulent transfer, every forged document, and every lie they've told to financial institutions and legal authorities. James spread financial charts across the table that mapped the flow of money from our business accounts to offshore entities and personal investments that David and Rebecca had established without my knowledge. The visual representation of their theft was staggering in its scope and sophistication, showing a systematic diversion of funds that had been occurring for over 2 years, and that totaled nearly $800,000 when all transfers and investments were accounted for. The beauty of financial crimes, James explained, pointing to transactions that had been disguised as consulting fees and professional services, is that criminals always leave a paper trail because they need documentation to access and move the money they're stealing. David and Rebecca thought they were being clever by structuring their theft as legitimate business expenses. But every fake invoice and fabricated contract they created is evidence that will be used to prosecute them and recover your assets. Michael Torres added another dimension to the evidence that had been assembled against my business partners, revealing that our case was not isolated, but part of a pattern of behavior that Rebecca had engaged in with previous business partners in Seattle and Portland. His investigation had uncovered 2 other women who had been targeted in similar schemes, both of whom had been manipulated into bankruptcy proceedings that discharged their ability to recover assets while protecting Rebecca's personal wealth from legal action. Rebecca Chang is what we call a serial business predator, Michael explained, showing me photographs and financial records from her previous partnerships. She identifies successful small business owners, usually women, who have built profitable companies but who don't have sophisticated financial management experience. She gains their trust, becomes essential to their operations, and then systematically diverts business assets while preparing for bankruptcy proceedings that eliminate their ability to recover what's been stolen. The revelation that I had been targeted as part of a deliberate pattern, rather than being the victim of circumstances that had spiraled out of control, was both terrifying and oddly comforting. Terrifying, because it meant that every aspect of my relationship with Rebecca had been calculated manipulation designed to position me for financial destruction. But comforting, because it meant that I was not responsible for failing to recognize warning signs that a more experienced person might have identified earlier. "What about David?" I asked, struggling to understand how my husband fit into a pattern of behavior that predated our business partnership. Was he recruited by Rebecca, or was he a willing participant in planning this from the beginning? Monica's expression suggested that David's role in the conspiracy was more complicated and more personal than I was prepared to hear. "Sarah, there are some aspects of David's involvement that are going to be difficult for you to process," she said carefully. James's investigation has uncovered evidence that David and Rebecca's relationship extends beyond business partnership into personal territory that explains some of their coordination and their confidence that they could manipulate you without detection. The implication that David and Rebecca were involved romantically hit me like a physical blow, not just because of the betrayal it represented, but because it explained so many aspects of their behavior that had confused me over the previous months. Their private meetings, their coordinated responses to my questions, their shared confidence in excluding me from financial decisions, all made sense if they were partners in more than just business and conspiracy. "How long has this been going on?" I asked, dreading the answer but needing to understand the complete scope of the deception that had been constructed around me. James consulted his notes and pulled out what appeared to be hotel receipts and travel records that documented David and Rebecca's relationship timeline. Based on credit card records and travel documentation, it appears that their personal relationship began approximately 14 months ago, which coincides with the period when the most significant financial transfers began occurring, he said. The timing suggests that their romantic involvement may have been the catalyst for escalating their conspiracy from simple asset diversion to the more elaborate bankruptcy scheme they've developed. The knowledge that my husband had been having an affair with my business partner while they systematically stole money from our company felt like a complete inversion of everything I had believed about my life for the previous year. Every evening when David had come home claiming to be exhausted from working with Rebecca to save our business, every weekend when they had met to develop financial strategies that supposedly protected my interests, every conversation where they had presented themselves as my advocates against circumstances beyond our control, had been a performance designed to hide the fact that they were lovers planning my financial destruction. "There's more," Monica continued, her voice gentle but determined to ensure that I understood the complete truth before we entered the courtroom. "Michael's investigation has revealed that David and Rebecca have already established a new business entity in Delaware, with corporate accounts and client contracts that suggest they've been planning to continue operating without you long before any bankruptcy proceedings were initiated." The documentation that Michael provided showed that David and Rebecca had been secretly competing with our existing business while using their access to our client relationships and proprietary information to build what amounted to a replacement company. They had incorporated under the name Phoenix Strategic Marketing and had already secured contracts with several clients who were currently paying Mitchell & Chang Marketing Solutions for services that were apparently being provided by their new entity. "They've been double billing clients," James explained, pointing to financial records that showed payments to both our existing business and their new company for identical services. Clients who think they're paying Mitchell & Chang for marketing campaigns are actually funding Phoenix Strategic Marketing, while the money that should be going to your business is being diverted to accounts that you have no access to or knowledge of. The sophistication and long-term planning that the evidence revealed made it clear that David and Rebecca had been systematically destroying my financial security while building their own wealth and business independence. The bankruptcy proceeding that they had presented as a last resort to save our shared business was actually the final step in a plan that would eliminate my ability to compete with them professionally while clearing their legal obligations to the business they had been looting for their personal benefit. As we prepared to leave for the courthouse, Monica outlined the strategy that would expose David and Rebecca's conspiracy while protecting my interests and maximizing the chances of recovering assets they had stolen. Instead of arriving early and waiting nervously for David to appear, we would time our entrance to create maximum impact when they were least prepared to respond to unexpected developments. David and Rebecca are expecting to control today's narrative, Monica explained as we loaded our evidence into her car. They've prepared statements and financial documentation that support their version of events, and they're confident that you'll be too intimidated and confused to challenge their authority effectively. Instead, you're going to arrive with legal representation that has already filed motions to freeze their personal assets and initiate criminal investigations into their financial activities. The drive to the Maricopa County Superior Court felt surreal, as if I were traveling to attend someone else's legal proceeding, rather than a hearing that would determine my own financial future. The woman who had sat in this same courthouse just 2 days earlier, confused and abandoned by her husband, was returning with the kind of legal firepower that suggested she was no longer a victim, but someone who intended to fight back with every resource at her disposal. When we arrived at the courthouse at 8:45, 15 minutes before the scheduled hearing, I could see David and Rebecca standing outside room 4B with Robert Hayes, engaged in what appeared to be an intense discussion about strategy and timing. David was dressed in the same navy suit he had worn on the morning he had disappeared, and his body language suggested the confidence of someone who believed he was about to complete a successful financial manipulation without significant opposition. Rebecca was dressed in an expensive gray business suit that I didn't recognize, and she carried herself with the professional composure that had always made her seem trustworthy and competent. Robert Hayes stood between them with a briefcase and a folder of what I assumed were the bankruptcy documents they expected me to sign without question or independent legal advice. Monica, James, Michael, and I approached the courthouse entrance with the purposeful stride of people who were arriving to take control of a situation rather than to passively participate in someone else's plans. I watched David's expression change from confidence to confusion to something approaching panic as he recognized that I was not arriving alone and unprepared as he had expected. "Sarah," David called out as we walked past him toward the courtroom entrance. "Who are these people, and why didn't you tell me you were hiring additional legal representation?" I stopped and turned to face him, flanked by my legal team and feeling more powerful than I had in months. "David, these are the attorneys and investigators who have been helping me understand the true financial condition of our business and the nature of the bankruptcy proceeding you've been planning without my informed consent," I replied, my voice steady and calm, despite the adrenaline that was coursing through my system. Rebecca stepped forward with the kind of professional smile that I had seen her use to diffuse client concerns and project confidence during difficult negotiations. "Sarah, I think there may be some misunderstanding about the legal process we're following," she said, her tone suggesting that my independent legal representation was an unnecessary complication that could be easily resolved through reasonable discussion. "The only misunderstanding," Monica interjected, stepping slightly in front of me to establish her role as my legal advocate, "is your apparent belief that Mrs. Mitchell would participate in bankruptcy proceedings without understanding that you and Mr. Mitchell have been systematically diverting business assets to personal accounts while fabricating debts to justify this filing." The expression on Rebecca's face shifted from professional confidence to something that looked like genuine alarm, as she realized that her financial activities had been discovered and documented by people who understood the legal implications of what she and David had been doing. Robert Hayes moved closer to Rebecca and David, apparently recognizing that the situation had become more complex than he had been prepared to handle. "I think we should move this discussion into the courtroom where it can be addressed through proper legal procedures," Robert suggested, but his voice carried uncertainty that suggested he was beginning to understand that his clients might not have provided him with accurate information about the case he was representing. Monica agreed that the courtroom was the appropriate venue for resolving the issues that had been raised, but she made it clear that the proceeding would not follow the script that David and Rebecca had apparently prepared. "Your Honor," she said as we approached Judge Patricia Morrison's bench, "I am Monica Williams, representing Mrs. Sarah Mitchell separately from the other parties in this matter. We have evidence of financial fraud and asset diversion that makes the bankruptcy proceeding as currently structured inappropriate and potentially illegal." Judge Morrison, the same woman who had granted the postponement when David failed to appear for our original hearing, looked from Monica to Robert Hayes, with the expression of someone who was recognizing that a routine bankruptcy proceeding had become significantly more complicated. "Ms. Williams, are you suggesting that there are criminal activities involved in this case that require investigation before bankruptcy proceedings can continue?" "Yes, Your Honor," Monica replied, approaching the bench with a thick folder of documentation. "We have evidence that Mr. Mitchell and Ms. Chang have diverted approximately $800,000 in business assets to personal accounts, while fabricating debts to justify bankruptcy proceedings that would discharge Mrs. Mitchell's ability to recover funds that have been systematically stolen from the business she helped create." The courtroom became silent as Judge Morrison reviewed the financial documents that Monica had presented, her expression growing more serious as she examined evidence that clearly contradicted the financial crisis that had supposedly necessitated bankruptcy protection. David and Rebecca sat at the defendant's table with Robert Hayes, their body language suggesting increasing awareness that their carefully constructed plan was collapsing under scrutiny that they had not anticipated. "Mr. Hayes," Judge Morrison said after several minutes of reviewing our evidence, "the financial records presented by Mrs. Mitchell's counsel appear to contradict the financial statements that you filed with this court. Can you explain these discrepancies?" Robert Hayes consulted his files and conferred briefly with David and Rebecca before responding with the kind of careful language that lawyers use when they suspect their clients have not been truthful with them. "Your Honor, I believe there may be some confusion about which financial records reflect the current status of the business versus historical data that predates the financial difficulties that necessitated this filing." James Thompson stepped forward with additional documentation that he had prepared specifically to address this type of deflection. "Your Honor, the financial records we've provided include bank statements, wire transfer documentation, and corporate filings that cover the entire period during which debts were supposedly accumulating. These records show consistent profitability and reveal systematic transfer of funds to accounts controlled by Mr. Mitchell and Ms. Chang without the knowledge or consent of Mrs. Mitchell." Judge Morrison's examination of James's documentation was thorough and methodical, and I could see her expression shift from judicial neutrality to something that looked like controlled anger as she recognized the scope of the deception that had been presented to her court. When she finally looked up from the financial records, her attention was focused entirely on David and Rebecca, rather than on the bankruptcy proceeding they had initiated. "Mr. Mitchell and Ms. Chang," Judge Morrison said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had recognized that she was dealing with potential criminal fraud rather than legitimate financial difficulties. "I am suspending these bankruptcy proceedings pending investigation of the financial irregularities that have been brought to the court's attention. I am also ordering that all business and personal assets belonging to both of you be frozen until this matter can be resolved through appropriate legal channels." David's composure finally cracked completely as he realized that the asset freeze would prevent him and Rebecca from accessing the money they had been systematically stealing from our business. "Your Honor, I think there's been a serious misunderstanding about our financial situation," he said, his voice carrying desperation that I had never heard from him before. "We've been trying to save the business and protect all three partners from financial liability that could destroy our personal credit and assets." "Mr. Mitchell," Judge Morrison replied, "the evidence presented by your wife's counsel suggests that you and Ms. Chang have been protecting yourselves by systematically transferring business assets to personal accounts while creating artificial debts to justify bankruptcy proceedings that would eliminate Mrs. Mitchell's ability to recover funds that appear to have been stolen. These are serious allegations that require investigation by appropriate authorities." Rebecca attempted to maintain her professional composure, but I could see the panic in her eyes as she realized that her pattern of targeting female business partners had finally been exposed by someone who had the resources and determination to fight back effectively. "Your Honor, I believe that Mrs. Mitchell's counsel may be misinterpreting routine financial management decisions and legitimate business expenses as evidence of wrongdoing." Michael Torres stepped forward with documentation that demonstrated Rebecca's history of similar activities with previous business partners in other states. Your Honor, Ms. Chang has been involved in at least 2 previous cases where female business partners filed for bankruptcy, while she continued operating replacement businesses using assets and client relationships from the dissolved partnerships. The pattern of behavior documented in those cases is identical to what has occurred in Mrs. Mitchell's situation. The revelation that Rebecca was a serial predator who had targeted multiple women in similar schemes created a level of outrage in the courtroom that was visible even in Judge Morrison's carefully controlled judicial demeanor. The bankruptcy proceeding that David and Rebecca had presented as an unfortunate necessity caused by market conditions was being revealed as the latest iteration of a sophisticated criminal enterprise designed to systematically destroy women's financial security while enriching their conspirators. I am ordering immediate criminal investigation of this matter, Judge Morrison announced, and I am referring Mr. Mitchell and Ms. Chang to the appropriate authorities for prosecution of financial fraud, asset diversion, and conspiracy to commit bankruptcy fraud. Mrs. Mitchell, you are dismissed from these proceedings, and your legal counsel should pursue civil recovery of assets through appropriate channels. As we left the courtroom, I could see David and Rebecca being approached by investigators who had apparently been summoned by Judge Morrison's staff during the hearing. The man who had been my husband for 6 years and the woman who had been my business partner for 5 years were about to be arrested for crimes that would likely result in federal prosecution and lengthy prison sentences. Monica, James, and Michael walked beside me as we exited the courthouse, their professional satisfaction evident in their expressions, and their confident discussion of the next steps in recovering assets and pursuing additional legal action against David and Rebecca. The woman who had entered this building 3 hours earlier as the victim of a conspiracy was leaving as someone who had successfully exposed and defeated her attackers. Sarah, Monica said as we reached the parking lot, I want you to understand that what happened in that courtroom represents a complete victory over people who believed they could manipulate and deceive you without consequences. David and Rebecca are going to face criminal prosecution, their assets are frozen, and we have a clear path to recover everything they stole from you. The realization that I had not only escaped the financial trap that had been set for me, but had actually succeeded in bringing my attackers to justice, was overwhelming in ways that I struggled to process. The bankruptcy hearing that I had dreaded as the final destruction of my financial security had become the venue for exposing a criminal conspiracy and beginning the process of holding the perpetrators accountable for their actions. As I drove home from the courthouse, I understood that my life would never return to what it had been before I discovered David and Rebecca's betrayal, but it would also never again be controlled by people who believed they could exploit my trust and dedication for their personal enrichment. The woman who had built a successful business through hard work and creativity was about to rebuild her life with the added strength that comes from surviving an attempt at complete financial destruction and emerging victorious against people who had underestimated her determination to fight back. The aftermath of the courthouse confrontation unfolded with the swift efficiency of a legal system that had recognized a clear case of financial fraud and conspiracy. Within hours of Judge Morrison's ruling, federal investigators had executed search warrants on David and Rebecca's personal residences, business offices, and financial institutions, seizing computers, documents, and records that would provide additional evidence for the criminal prosecution that was already being prepared by the U.S. Attorney's Office. I spent the remainder of that Tuesday in Monica's office, signing documents that would initiate the civil asset recovery process, and reviewing the preliminary timeline for criminal proceedings that would likely extend over the next 12 to 18 months. The complexity of unraveling David and Rebecca's financial manipulation was staggering, involving not just the money they had stolen from our business, but also the elaborate corporate structures they had created to hide their theft and the false documentation they had provided to banks, attorneys, and government agencies. Sarah, I want you to understand that what we accomplished today is just the beginning of a much longer process, Monica explained as we reviewed the asset freeze orders that had been issued against David and Rebecca. Criminal prosecution will proceed on its own timeline, but civil asset recovery requires us to trace every fraudulent transaction and identify all accounts and investments where your money has been hidden. James Thompson had already begun the forensic accounting process that would be necessary to recover the maximum amount of stolen assets, working with federal investigators who had the authority to access international banking records and offshore investment accounts that would have been beyond the reach of private civil litigation. His preliminary analysis suggested that the $800,000 we had identified during our investigation was only a portion of the total amount that David and Rebecca had diverted from legitimate business operations. The beauty of financial criminals, James explained as he organized bank records and wire transfer documentation into chronological order, is that they always believe they're smarter than the people they're stealing from. So they keep detailed records of their crimes because they need those records to access and manage the money they've stolen. David and Rebecca documented every aspect of their conspiracy, which makes our job of recovering your assets much more straightforward than it would be in cases where criminals try to hide their activities. Michael Torres added that his investigation had revealed coordination between Rebecca and financial facilitators in the Cayman Islands and Swiss banking institutions, who specialized in helping American business owners hide assets from domestic legal proceedings. The international scope of the conspiracy elevated the criminal charges from state-level fraud to federal crimes that carried much more severe penalties, and that would be prosecuted by attorneys who specialized in complex financial cases. Rebecca Chang is looking at 15 to 20 years in federal prison, Michael said, consulting notes from his conversation with the federal prosecutor who had been assigned to the case. David's sentence will depend on his level of cooperation with the investigation and his willingness to provide information about Rebecca's other victims and the financial facilitators who helped them hide stolen assets. The possibility that David might cooperate with federal prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence was both encouraging and disturbing. Encouraging because it would accelerate the asset recovery process, but disturbing because it meant that his betrayal of our marriage had been calculated enough that he would now betray his co-conspirator to minimize his own legal consequences. The man who had shared my bed for 6 years while systematically planning my financial destruction was apparently willing to sacrifice anyone, including his lover, to protect himself from the full consequences of his crimes. Over the following weeks, as federal investigators expanded their inquiry into Rebecca's previous victims and David provided increasingly detailed information about their conspiracy, I began to understand the full scope of what I had unknowingly escaped. Rebecca's pattern of targeting successful women business owners was more extensive than Michael's initial investigation had revealed, involving at least 7 victims over the previous decade, and total losses that exceeded $4 million. The other victims were women remarkably similar to myself, educated, hard-working entrepreneurs who had built profitable businesses through creativity and dedication, but who lacked the financial sophistication to recognize the sophisticated manipulation techniques that Rebecca employed to gain control of their assets. Several of the women had lost everything and had been forced to rebuild their careers from nothing, while others had never recovered financially from the systematic theft that Rebecca had disguised as business partnership. "You're the first person who had the resources and determination to fight back effectively," explained Jennifer Walsh, a former business partner of Rebecca's from Seattle, who had lost over $600,000 when their marketing consultancy was dissolved through bankruptcy proceedings nearly identical to what David and Rebecca had planned for me. "Most of us were too overwhelmed and financially devastated to pursue legal action, and Rebecca was always careful to leave just enough assets untouched that bankruptcy actually provided some relief from the debts she had created in our names." Jennifer's story was heartbreakingly familiar, involving the same pattern of gradual exclusion from financial decision-making, the same fabrication of business debts that required bankruptcy protection, and the same coordination between Rebecca and accomplices who provided legal and financial services that appeared legitimate but were actually designed to facilitate asset theft. The primary difference was that Jennifer had trusted Rebecca's guidance completely and had signed bankruptcy documents without independent legal representation, effectively surrendering any ability to recover assets that had been systematically stolen from their business. "I wish I had been brave enough to question what was happening," Jennifer said during our phone conversation, her voice carrying regret that was still fresh despite the passage of nearly 3 years since her bankruptcy. "But Rebecca was so convincing about the legal necessity of bankruptcy, and I was so overwhelmed by the supposed financial crisis, that I just wanted someone else to handle the complex decisions that seemed beyond my ability to understand." The conversations I had with Rebecca's other victims reinforced my understanding of how narrowly I had escaped complete financial destruction, and how crucial Monica's advice about independent legal representation had been to exposing the conspiracy before it could be completed. The women who had trusted Rebecca's guidance without question had lost not just their businesses and their savings, but often their homes, their credit, and their confidence in their ability to rebuild their professional lives. As the federal investigation progressed, and more evidence of David and Rebecca's crimes was uncovered, I made the decision to rebuild my professional life on a foundation that could never again be compromised by partners who might exploit my trust for their personal enrichment. Instead of attempting to resurrect Mitchell & Chang Marketing Solutions, which was permanently contaminated by the fraud that had been committed in its name, I established Sarah Morgan Creative, a new business entity that reflected my maiden name and my determination to maintain complete control over my financial future. The asset recovery process had already returned nearly $400,000 to accounts under my control, money that had been frozen in David and Rebecca's personal accounts, and that represented the most easily identifiable portion of what they had stolen from our original business. Additional funds were being recovered from offshore accounts and investment vehicles, as federal investigators worked with international banking authorities to trace the complete flow of diverted assets. We expect to recover at least 75% of the stolen funds, Monica reported during one of our monthly progress meetings, and potentially as much as 90% if David continues cooperating with federal prosecutors and provides information that leads to recovery of assets that are currently hidden in more sophisticated financial structures. The recovered money provided the capital I needed to establish my new business with professional office space, state-of-the-art equipment, and a marketing budget that would allow me to compete immediately for the high-quality clients that I had learned to identify and serve during my years with Mitchell & Chang. More importantly, the experience of successfully fighting back against a sophisticated financial conspiracy had given me confidence in my own judgment and determination that made me a much stronger entrepreneur than I had been when I first started working with David and Rebecca. Sarah Morgan Creative opened for business 6 months after the courthouse confrontation that had exposed David and Rebecca's crimes, operating from a modern office space in downtown Phoenix that reflected my professional capabilities without requiring the kind of substantial capital investment that might tempt future partners to view my business as a target for exploitation. I hired 2 junior account coordinators and a part-time bookkeeper, maintaining a lean operational structure that would allow me to maintain close oversight of all financial activities while building towards sustainable growth. The first major client contract I secured was with Phoenix Metropolitan Hospital, a healthcare system that needed comprehensive rebranding and digital marketing services worth over $100,000 annually. The irony of working with a healthcare organization was not lost on me, given that my previous business relationship had required the kind of intensive care that criminal prosecution and asset recovery represent. But the hospital's commitment to ethical practices and transparent communication made them an ideal partner for rebuilding my professional reputation. "We were impressed by your presentation," said Dr. Patricia Martinez, the hospital's chief marketing officer. "But we were even more impressed by your background and your determination to maintain the highest ethical standards in your business practices." Healthcare organizations need marketing partners who understand that trust and integrity are not just professional values, but essential requirements for serving communities effectively. The hospital contract became the foundation for rebuilding my client base with organizations that valued ethical business practices and long-term partnerships over short-term cost savings or flashy marketing gimmicks. Within 12 months of opening Sarah Morgan Creative, I had secured contracts with 3 additional healthcare organizations, 2 nonprofit foundations, and a regional law firm that specialized in representing small businesses against larger corporate competitors. The criminal prosecution of David and Rebecca proceeded through federal court with the kind of methodical precision that complex financial fraud cases require, involving testimony from multiple victims, extensive documentation of fraudulent transactions, and expert analysis of the sophisticated schemes they had used to hide stolen assets. David's cooperation with prosecutors resulted in a plea agreement that reduced his sentence to 8 years in federal prison, while Rebecca's refusal to cooperate or accept responsibility for her crimes resulted in a 22-year sentence that effectively ended her career as a financial predator. Justice doesn't always provide the emotional satisfaction that victims hope for, Monica explained as we reviewed the final sentencing documents. But in this case, the sentences are substantial enough to ensure that neither David nor Rebecca will be in a position to victimize other people for a very long time. And the asset forfeiture orders mean that they won't be able to enjoy the benefits of their crimes even after they're released from prison. The asset recovery process ultimately returned over $700,000 to my control, funds that had been systematically stolen from our original business, but that now provided the financial foundation for Sarah Morgan Creative's expansion into new service areas and larger client relationships. The recovered money also allowed me to establish a legal defense fund that would provide resources for pursuing additional civil litigation if other assets were discovered or if David and Rebecca attempted to hide additional funds that hadn't been identified during the federal investigation. Beyond the financial recovery, the experience of successfully fighting back against people who had attempted to destroy my life had fundamentally changed my understanding of my own capabilities and my approach to both business relationships and personal partnerships. The woman who had once trusted completely in other people's management of crucial decisions had become someone who insisted on maintaining direct oversight of every aspect of her financial and professional life. "You've become a different person," Lisa observed during one of our regular sister lunches. "Not in a way that makes you harder or less trusting, but in a way that makes you much more confident in your own judgment, and much less willing to defer to other people's supposed expertise when your own interests are at stake." Lisa's observation was accurate in ways that extended beyond my professional life into every aspect of how I approached relationships and decision-making. The experience of being systematically deceived by people I had trusted completely had made me much more attentive to inconsistencies between what people said and what they actually did, and much more insistent on maintaining independent verification of information that affected my interests. The divorce from David was finalized 18 months after his arrest, a legal process that was complicated by the criminal proceedings, but that ultimately resulted in my complete financial independence and his forfeiture of any claim to assets that had been recovered through the federal investigation. The man who had attempted to trap me in bankruptcy proceedings that would have eliminated my ability to rebuild my financial life was left with nothing except substantial legal debts and the prospect of spending the next 8 years in federal prison. David's attorney contacted us about negotiating some kind of settlement that would give him access to a small portion of the recovered assets, Monica reported during our final divorce-related meeting. But I advised them that their client had forfeited any right to financial consideration when he chose to participate in a criminal conspiracy designed to defraud his wife. The final dissolution of my marriage to David felt like the completion of a surgical procedure that had removed a malignant growth that had been systematically destroying my financial health, while disguising itself as a loving partnership. The relief of being legally separated from someone who had been willing to sacrifice my future for his personal enrichment was profound in ways that I continued to discover months after the divorce decree was finalized. 2 years after the courthouse confrontation that had exposed David and Rebecca's conspiracy, Sarah Morgan Creative had grown into a regional marketing firm with 12 employees, offices in both Phoenix and Tucson, and annual revenue that exceeded anything I had achieved during my partnership with Mitchell & Chang Marketing Solutions. The business had been featured in Arizona Business Magazine as an example of successful entrepreneurship, and I had been invited to speak at several professional conferences about ethical business practices and the importance of maintaining financial oversight in partnership arrangements. Your story has become a cautionary tale that business schools use to teach students about the warning signs of financial fraud in partnership arrangements, explained Professor Maria Santos from Arizona State University's Business School, who had invited me to guest lecture for her entrepreneurship course. But it's also an inspiring example of how someone can recover from systematic betrayal and build something even stronger than what was destroyed. The speaking engagements and media attention that resulted from my experience had created opportunities to help other entrepreneurs avoid the kind of systematic financial manipulation that I had survived, and to provide resources for people who discovered that their business partners might be exploiting their trust for personal enrichment. I had established a consulting practice that specialized in helping small business owners implement financial oversight systems that would prevent the kind of asset diversion that David and Rebecca had been able to accomplish. The most important lesson I learned, I explained to Professor Santos's students, is that trust in business relationships should always be coupled with independent verification of financial activities. and that anyone who discourages or prevents such verification is probably hiding something that they don't want you to discover. Ethical business partners welcome transparency because they have nothing to hide. The consulting work had also led to collaboration with law enforcement agencies that investigated financial fraud cases, providing expertise about the warning signs that victims should watch for, and the documentation that was most crucial for recovering stolen assets. The experience of being targeted by sophisticated financial predators had given me insights that were valuable for both preventing similar crimes and helping other victims fight back effectively when prevention wasn't sufficient. 3 years after rebuilding my life from the financial destruction that David and Rebecca had planned for me, I received a phone call that provided final confirmation that justice had been served and that my decision to fight back had protected other potential victims from similar crimes. Michael Torres, the financial crimes investigator who had been instrumental in exposing their conspiracy, contacted me with news that Rebecca's prison sentence had been extended after additional victims came forward with evidence of crimes that predated her partnership with David. Rebecca Chang has been sentenced to an additional 15 years in federal prison, Michael reported, and the total asset forfeiture orders now exceed $6 million, which will be distributed among all the victims of her various schemes. Your decision to fight back, instead of accepting the bankruptcy terms they offered, has led to justice for at least a dozen other women who might never have recovered anything if their cases hadn't been connected to the broader investigation that your case initiated. The knowledge that my resistance to David and Rebecca's manipulation had prevented other women from suffering similar financial destruction was more satisfying than any personal victory I had achieved through the asset recovery process. The woman who had been targeted as an isolated victim had become the catalyst for exposing a broader pattern of crimes and ensuring that the perpetrators faced consequences that would prevent them from continuing their predatory behavior. 5 years after the courthouse confrontation that had changed the trajectory of my life, I was invited to serve on the advisory board of the National Association of Small Business Owners, providing input on legislative proposals designed to strengthen protections for entrepreneurs against financial fraud and partnership abuse. The experience of surviving sophisticated financial manipulation had given me credibility with lawmakers and business organizations that were working to prevent similar crimes against other small business owners. Your case has become the template for how financial fraud victims can fight back effectively, explained Congressman Robert Chen, who had sponsored legislation requiring enhanced disclosure requirements for business partnership agreements. The combination of forensic accounting, criminal prosecution, and civil asset recovery that you pursued has become the standard approach that law enforcement agencies recommend for similar cases. The legislative work provided an opportunity to influence policy decisions that would make it more difficult for future financial predators to target small business owners, and more likely that victims would have the resources and legal support necessary to fight back effectively. The woman who had once been manipulated by people who understood legal and financial systems better than she did had become someone who helped shape those systems to protect other potential victims. Sarah Morgan Creative continued to grow and evolve, becoming not just a successful marketing firm, but also a platform for advocating for ethical business practices and supporting other entrepreneurs who were building businesses based on transparency and mutual respect rather than exploitation and deception. The company had established a scholarship program for women business students and a mentorship initiative that provided guidance for female entrepreneurs who were navigating the challenges of building sustainable businesses in competitive markets. You've turned your experience into something that helps other people avoid similar problems, observed Amanda Chen, my longtime friend who had watched me rebuild my life from the financial destruction that David and Rebecca had planned. Instead of just recovering from what happened to you, you've created something that prevents it from happening to other people. Amanda's observation captured the transformation that had occurred not just in my professional life but in my understanding of my own purpose and capabilities. The experience of being systematically betrayed by people I had trusted completely had been devastating, but the experience of successfully fighting back and building something stronger than what had been destroyed had revealed capabilities and determination that I hadn't known I possessed. 6 years after the day I sat alone in room 4B of the Maricopa County Superior Court, abandoned by my husband and facing financial ruin that I didn't understand, I returned to that same courthouse as an expert witness in another financial fraud case, providing testimony that helped another woman recover assets that had been stolen by business partners who had used techniques remarkably similar to what David and Rebecca had employed against me. "Mrs. Morgan," said the defense attorney who was cross-examining me about the warning signs that victims should have recognized, "isn't it true that sophisticated financial fraud is designed specifically to be undetectable by people who don't have advanced training in accounting and business law?" "That's exactly the point," I replied, looking directly at the jury that would decide whether the defendant in this case would face criminal penalties for financial crimes. Sophisticated financial fraud depends on victims trusting their partners completely and not asking the questions that would expose the deception. The solution isn't for every business owner to become a forensic accountant, but rather to implement oversight systems that make it impossible for partners to divert assets without detection and consent. The testimony I provided in that case, and in several similar cases over the following months, helped establish legal precedents that strengthened protections for small business owners and increased the penalties for people who exploited partnership arrangements to commit financial fraud. The woman who had once been a victim was now someone who helped ensure that other victims could fight back effectively and that perpetrators faced consequences that would deter similar crimes. As I reflect on the journey from financial destruction to successful entrepreneurship and advocacy, I understand that the most important victory was not recovering the money that David and Rebecca had stolen or seeing them sentenced to federal prison, but rather discovering that I possessed the strength and determination to fight back against people who had systematically underestimated my capabilities. The woman who had been targeted as a victim had become someone who helped other victims become survivors. The courthouse where I had once sat abandoned and confused had become a place where I helped other people fight for justice and recovery. The business that had been destroyed by financial fraud had been replaced by something stronger and more successful than what had been lost. The marriage that had been built on deception and exploitation had been replaced by independence and self-determination that could never again be compromised by someone else's betrayal. Sarah Morgan Creative now operates with annual revenue exceeding $2 million, employing 23 people and serving clients throughout the Southwest who value ethical business practices and long-term partnerships over short-term cost savings or questionable financial arrangements. The success has been built on a foundation of transparency, independent financial oversight, and commitment to treating employees and clients with the kind of respect and honesty that I learned to demand for myself. The woman who once trusted completely in other people's management of her financial future now maintains direct oversight of every aspect of her business operations, not from paranoia but from understanding that trust must be coupled with verification to prevent exploitation. The entrepreneur who once deferred to partners with supposedly superior expertise now trusts her own judgment and insists on understanding every decision that affects her interests. Most importantly, the person who was once isolated and vulnerable to sophisticated manipulation has become someone who helps other people recognize warning signs, implement protective measures, and fight back effectively when prevention isn't sufficient. The experience of surviving financial betrayal has become a source of strength rather than trauma, and a platform for helping other people transform their own experiences, from victimization to empowerment. The bankruptcy court hearing that I had dreaded as the final destruction of everything I had worked to build had become the venue for exposing a criminal conspiracy and beginning the process of building something stronger than what had been lost. The husband who had abandoned me when I needed support had been replaced by independence that could never again be threatened by someone else's betrayal. The business partners who had attempted to steal my future had been replaced by employees and clients who shared my commitment to ethical practices and mutual success. Standing in my office today, looking out at the Phoenix skyline where I rebuilt my life after systematic financial betrayal, I understand that the most powerful victory was not defeating the people who tried to destroy me, but discovering that I possessed the strength to rebuild my life according to my own values and priorities. The woman who was once manipulated by people who exploited her trust had become someone who helped other people transform their trust into strength rather than vulnerability. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.